welcome to Chat from the Old Cap, episode number 7. My name is Tony Hakes. I'm the Director of Regional Programs for the University of Iowa Center for Advancement. We're very excited to have one of our more notable alum, Bob Lerman, joining us today. Bob has done a lot for the university. He's done a lot throughout his career, and we're very fortunate that he's going to be talking about a number of those things in his career and his time at Iowa, in particular when he had the chance to work with Kurt Vonnegut. Mr. Lehrman is a 1968 graduate from the Writers' Workshop. He's a novelist, a former White House speechwriter who wrote and edited hundreds of speeches for Vice President Al Gore. The Irish Writers' Workshop will discuss his time working with Gore, as well as writer Kurt Vonnegut, as I just mentioned, who was his advisor while he was here at Iowa. Mr. Lehrman wrote The Political Speechwriter's Companion, a guide for writers and speakers, and co-authored a second edition of the highly acclaimed book. He teaches political speechwriting at American University and has written more than 1,000 speeches for national politicians, corporate and nonprofit CEOs, and celebrities. Lehrman has penned dozens of articles, op-eds under his own name in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Hill, USA Today, and Christian Science Monitor Sunday magazine, among other places. Bob, welcome to our show. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. It was really great when we got to meet you a few weeks ago and talk about your time here in Iowa City and your really incredible career. We just really appreciate you coming back and being our guest.
Well, I was honored to go to the workshop, and I'm glad you think I have something interesting to say.
You know, I know you've done a lot in politics, and I heard a story that Terry Branstad once kicked you in the head. Is that how you got active in politics at Iowa?
Yes, that was a time when the campus was really torn apart by hawks and doves. And we and my friends decided one day to blockade the student union against the evil ROTC recruiters who were coming. One of my friends said, this is a typical poet's demonstration. It was symbolic. We only blockaded one door, the door that was across from the parking garage. And I was there with my girlfriend, and we were debating, did we want to do this? And here came the Iowa State Police down the street. I remember they were in blue uniforms, and they were holding nightsticks, I think. They lined up. And then down from the other corner came Terry and his group of followers. Now, I knew him slightly from Student Senate. Graduate students could be in Student Senate. And he was the head of Young Americans for Freedom. So he came in front of where we were, and I was in the front row. And he said, you people should not be here. And then he ran from across the street. And there was an awning with a kind of iron, the aluminum undergirding. He leaped up, grabbed the struts, and tried to swing over us. And he whacked me in the head. It was unforgettable. Well, I probably have forgotten some of it, but I didn't pass out. And it was totally unintentional. But it made me decide, all right, I don't think I want to stay here and get arrested. So we left. And I don't seem to have suffered much brain damage since then.
That's incredible. I've met Terry Branstad a number of times. I find it hard to believe that he would do something like that. He always seems pretty calm, but
he was a very likable person. We just disagreed about everything.
There you go. You mentioned Kurt Vonnegut. What a prolific writer there. Do you have any favorite memories or stories about him?
Yeah, one of the things you got to do at the workshop, the director of fiction was Vance Borgelli, who was a very good novelist. He had a farm, and he would have pig roasts and invite students in the fiction writing workshop, students out, and we would get a chance to spend a lot of time with faculty, and you get to know them. And Vonnegut was elated at that job. I remember once at one of those pig roasts, we were standing and talking. He said, this is the most I have ever made from writing, and he was making $10,000 a year. But he also, not all teachers were like this. He loved to teach. He told me one time that teaching was so enjoyable that it actually got in the way of his writing a little bit, because he would be saying, "Oh, so-and-so is going to come in. What do I want to say about that?" And you know, I teach now. I have turned out to love teaching too, and I think about my students a lot. I can understand how he felt, and he was, you know, he really cared a lot about reading carefully and talking about what his insights were. You know, there's one of my classmates from that year, Suzanne McConnell, has just published a book this year called Pity the Reader, where she did a really interesting thing. She took everything Vonnegut had ever written about writing, and she divided them up into chapters, and she comments very persuasively and perceptively on what he meant by that. I thought that was an interesting approach, and he was interesting.
That's very cool. I'm going to share my screen real quick. You've sent me this picture, and I wonder if you might tell us a little bit more about what's happening here. Hopefully everyone can see that okay, but who do we have here at the head of the class?
Yeah, that was, first you see Vonnegut is teaching. We see him from behind.
Okay.
I'm in that picture. If you look down the aisle, I'm on the right of the picture. 1, 2, 3 people. I'm wearing a V-neck sweater.
Okay.
In the front
here.
You know, the front on the left is Ian Macmillan, who wrote, I think, 9 or 10 books of stories. Dick Cummins is, who was a high jumper on the Iowa team as an undergraduate track team, is 3 down on the left of the screen.
Okay.
You know, there are a variety of people I could name. John Zielinski was the photographer for that. And we're in a barracks. In those days, there were all these barracks that were put up right beside the union, the student union, during World War II, and they were still there. They were drafty or sometimes overheated, but those were our classrooms.
That is amazing. And actually, your friend Dick Cummins sent me a question ahead of time. He was wondering if it was true that Vonnegut convinced you to take your first paid job with the university.
Yes. Do you want me to talk about that now? Yeah. Vonnegut actually got me into speechwriting, and he, at the end of the first semester, he said, "You know, I like your work. I can get you an assistantship. But you'd have to teach." And I, in my complete stupidity, said, "I don't know a thing about speech." He said, he's very practical. In fact, he and another teacher used to do a seminar for students saying how to make a living writing crap when you're trying to be a serious writer. He said, "Well, you better take it because it pays $1,800, which is what Iowa was then charging for a semester's tuition." So I did. They gave me a textbook, Monroe and Eninger. Eninger was on the Iowa faculty, and I think Monroe taught at Purdue then, Principles of Public Speaking. They died in the 1970s. The book is still in print. And it was really useful to me because Monroe had invented a structure for persuasive speech. It's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence, which is tremendously valuable. I use it myself all the time. It's kind of the default structure for political speech. And I taught speech for a number of years there. And when I decided that I wanted to go into politics, that instead of being Tolstoy, Gandhi was a much better model. I could do that, and I knew how speeches were made.
Oh, that's incredible, and what a group of classmates you've had there. It's people that we've all read and have some pretty famous careers, and I'm very honored to hear these stories. So let's talk about some of your speeches. You know, you've written thousands of speeches, which is really mind-boggling. How different is speech writing from fiction writing?
Well, of course, they both use words. Aside from that, um, there's one basic difference. When you write a story, you're trying to create characters that people can understand. There's a shock of recognition. They'll say, "Oh, that is exactly how I felt," or "I know somebody that is like that." Speeches in politics are persuasive. You are trying to talk about, persuade people to believe that an issue, a policy that you have is the best one. And so people of all political stripes can go to a production of Macbeth or read a novel and be equally responsive to it. But that's not the case with speeches. Now, I'll give you one example, and they can be very skillful, but still they provoke different reactions. So a couple of years ago, Joni Ernst, from Iowa, and Elizabeth Warren had a debate on the floor of the Senate about partial birth abortion. We actually use it in our book, because both sides, both speakers used the same kinds of techniques, concrete detail, story, very effectively. But the issue itself was so divisive that I don't think pro-choice people, to use the shortcut terms that people use, pro-choice people are not going to look at Joni Ernst's speech and say, "Oh, what a wonderful speech." They're going to say, "What? That idea is ridiculous." And Ernst supporters are going to look at Elizabeth Warren's, and despite the skill and whoever wrote that, they're going to say, "I totally disagree with that," and they're going to be angry. So that is, now there are novels that have a political bent, and but in literature and political speech, I think that difference makes very different reactions.
So that's some really interesting points. Is there, as those of us that see speeches happening constantly on news and in person, we live in Iowa, so we get a lot of the politicians come through here during election years and throughout. What do we not understand when it comes to writing a speech? Or from you, who's behind the scenes writing this, what limitations might you have, or what do we not see on our side?
Well, first, a lot of people don't realize that politicians have speechwriters. In fact, I've had people tell me, I did a workshop one time in Vietnam, and somebody looked at something we had on the screen, and they said, "Well, how does Obama memorize his speeches so easily?" I said, "He never memorizes his speeches." They said, "But look, he's looking right into the camera." I said, "He has a teleprompter." And I got an image of that up on the screen. And these very smart diplomats had never seen a teleprompter before. So that's one thing that people don't understand. In fact, but especially presidents have to have a team of speechwriters. When John Favreau got the job as chief speechwriter for Obama, he said to the communication director, "You sure that he wants to? He's a great writer." And the communications director said, "Yes, but somebody has to run the country. And meanwhile, he's going to be doing 400 speeches a year, maybe more. Somebody has to write those, and it's going to be you and your staff." And so one thing people do not understand is that working anonymously are these good writers who sacrifice seeing their own name on something for the privilege of altering policy, which is something I've tried to do.
Yeah, that's really incredible. How many writers would a typical, say the president, how many speech writers would they have at one time working for them?
I think Obama had 5 senior writers, but then 4 kind of junior aides. Now, when I joined Gore, Clinton had made a campaign promise to cut the White House budget by 25%. That was stupid. And then he did something even more stupid. He kept the promise. So when I wanted to write for Clinton, I talked to his chief speechwriter who said, well, you know, he's cutting the budget here. I only have 3 people, and it's got to be people that did the campaign. So we can't take you, but I'll make you my first recommendation for Gore. And I got along with Gore and his communication director. And at first, it was just me. And if my wife came out from behind the screen here and talked about those days, the schedule was grueling. I mean, I worked 6.5 days a week. Usually I didn't come home, and we had young kids, but before, you know, 9 or 10, or sometimes it was midnight, and I would be in the building next door to the White House, as the old executive office building, pacing the halls, and the only people that would be there would be the speechwriters.
Wow, so let's kind of shift into that and the politics of speechwriting. How does speechwriting in the White House compare to other places you've worked or other speeches you've had to write?
Well, I've done, the universe of speechwriters is you do political, you do corporate, which is the most lucrative kind of speechwriting there is, and then you do nonprofits, which I found the most enjoyable because the groups that, you know, echo the political beliefs I have, and universities. At one time, I did somebody from USC called. They said, would you do a workshop for our speechwriters? I said, well, how many speechwriters do you have? And she said, 19. I was just amazed by this. You know, USC is not an enormous school. She said, well, you know, the dean has 3, and the chancellor has 3, and every dean has, you know, at least 1, maybe 2. And so it adds up to 19. In those sort of compartments, to me, political speechwriting is the most rewarding, because you get to alter policy. You talk about issues of war and peace, or inequality, or racial justice, in addition to trade agreements and the other kinds of things that presidents do. And as anonymous as speechwriters are with those jobs, that was something I thought was really worth doing.
That's amazing to think about all of that goes into, you know, what the politicians are saying. And I know we talked about not getting too into, you know, sort of current politics, but did you have a favorite politician that you worked with when it came to giving those speeches, or someone that you think does an excellent job of delivering those?
Well, those are several different questions. People I like to work with, you know, I worked coincidentally for an Iowa graduate, David Bonnier, who was from Michigan. He was class of '67 at Iowa. I didn't know him at all, but I would go into the union and head for the ping pong tables. He was at the pool tables. So we probably crossed paths 1,000 times. Later, he became a congressman from Michigan, and then he was a part of the Democratic leadership. He was deputy whip and then whip. And I joined his staff, and working with him was a pleasure. And I'll tell you one thing, you know, that he did. After I was there a few days, one of his staffers said to me, you know, David said he's pro-life. You're probably pro-choice, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, David wanted to make sure that you knew that he would never ask you to write about an issue like that, because he didn't want you to have to go against your personal beliefs on something so volatile. Now, you know how often I think that would happen in speech life? Almost never. but that was the kind of person he was. He was really a powerful player in the 1990s. If you ever want to have him on this show, he would talk a lot about interesting things to do. And he wrote a book in which he has 40 pages or so reminiscing about his time at Iowa. So that was great. When writing for Gore, now, of course, we wrote about tremendously important issues. I wrote about 5 speeches a week. Now, maybe one of those were speeches where we had a full-blown speech conference. I would write something, come back, we talk about it, I'd go do revisions, maybe I'd be up on the plane for the trip. Then one other, I might duck my head in his door, and I'd say, I'm gonna do ACLU, and he'd say, okay, make sure you say X, Y, and Z. And then 2 or 3 of them, you know, their lives are so busy, vice president, president, senators, any of the national politicians, that I would, you know, work till midnight and give it to Secret Service security, who would drive it over to the mansion. And the next day I would be in the limousine, he'd come out and I'd see he's looking at it for the first time. So, you know, we certainly had interaction, but it's very different when you're in the White House.
Well, that's truly incredible and really interesting to hear. And you've really had quite the career. So I'm going to open it up to questions here. So if anyone would like to submit a question, you can do so through me in the chat, and then I'll forward that to Bob. And while we're getting that going, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and maybe where we could get our hands on some of your books?
Well, my 4 novels, some of which won awards, but they're all out of print. If you look at Amazon, Amazon has a bestseller list that goes from 1 to about 12 million, and some of mine are in the 7 million level. But in 2009, I wrote the Political Speechwriter's Companion, which is the only book really that talks about how to write political speech. And that stayed in print, sold steadily for 10 years. In 2018, Sage Publishers, which owns it now, wanted a 2nd edition, and I did that with Eric Schnur, who I'd worked with in the White House, and you know, we've worked on projects for a long time. We took about 1.5 years, and the 2nd edition just came out. And you can look on Amazon, or you can order, you know, through Sage. And it's doing, for this kind of niche book, it's getting a lot of praise, and I'm gratified for it. And one of the things that I am happy about is that, you know, this is a bitter political time. I don't think I have to tell anybody listening to this now. But we had a Republican, Lamar Alexander, is, you know, senator from Tennessee, who agreed to write the foreword. And that made me really happy, because while I have my own views as a teacher, my job is to be nonpartisan. And people have said that this is a book that's used by Democrats and Republicans, and I'm very happy about that. So that's available. And then I'm doing a lot of, you know, I've always wanted to be, to write things that have my name on them. And I haven't left fiction totally. In 2012, I wrote a story and I entered it in Narrative magazine as a contest, and I won that contest. And now I've gone back and I picked up a novel that I had left undone. I'm just about done with that. So I write a lot of op-eds on, you know, usually political topics for a magazine called The Hill, or I've done a series of cover stories for the Christian Science Monitor weekly magazine, often on political subjects, but not always. You know, sometimes I did one on video games, a great passion of one of my kids.
Well, you're certainly staying busy.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions coming in here. If you could give one piece of advice on those that are listening of what makes a great speech, what would you say?
Do you mean, I'd ask, do you mean, is the writing great, or is this something that's celebrated? Because in order for a speech to be well known, it has to be about a great issue. If the Gettysburg Address were about some trade deal that with European countries, I don't think people would remember it. It was about equality for all. And so the excellent things in the Gettysburg Address also go to support a great issue. You know, Dick Durbin is the senator from Illinois. He had a great speech one time. It really was brilliantly written. It was only about 2 minutes long. Nobody's ever heard of it because the issue was whether Major League Baseball should have metal bats or stick to the old wooden bats. So part of it is the issues that you deal with. But when I look at speeches, I look to see what I think Iowa influenced me to believe that story is so important in speeches. You know, if anybody remembers Oprah Winfrey's Golden Globe speech from about 2 years ago, she got up, she didn't say, oh, it's an honor to be here, thank you so-and-so, it's great to see so-and-so, you're a great group. First words she said were, it was 1964. I was sitting on the linoleum floor of my mother's apartment watching the Academy Awards, and up came the best looking Black man that I had ever seen. And it was about Sidney Poitier getting an award, and how stunning that was to her that somebody Black could get that award. She starts with story, and you need to do that to win attention right away. So that's one thing I look for. Now, repetition is important in speech. You know, in 6th grade, you may be told not to repeat yourself, but repetition in speech is a source of power. That's a sign to me of a skillful writer. There's a reason Martin Luther King said, I have a dream 5 times, not 1 time, because each time he could become more intense and carry the reader along. So there are techniques like that. Concrete detail is important. Understandable language is important. These are all things that can make a speech great. And one of the things I've learned to do when I looked at Ronald Reagan's speeches, which did have, his speechwriter was, and his speechwriting team really good. They were imaginative and full of story and humor, and very, very effective, even though I disagreed with all of them. So I think I would sum up by saying, you know, it's a combination. You got to have an issue that's important, but then you also need to have the kind of structure that works, which is the Monroe's motivated sequence I mentioned. You know, language, concrete detail, story, and repetition.
Excellent. Great advice. Do you have a favorite speech that you've written? Out of the thousands?
You know, they aren't always the speeches that have the big issues. So I wrote Gore's speech at Nelson Mandela's inauguration. That meant a lot to me. But I've said that Gore gave a speech to the Baseball Hall of Fame in New York. It was a fundraising dinner. I wrote it. I went up with him. I had 2 baseballs in my pocket, my jacket pocket. I looked around. I saw all the ball players I idolized growing up. I mean, Stan Musial, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Yogi Berra. I just walked around getting autographs, and that was unforgettable to me.
I've got a couple more here, and then we'll probably wrap things up. But someone says, we hear you actually influenced a great Hawkeye sports story. Is that true?
You'll have to tell me the name of who asked that. But yes, I didn't realize this until last month when the Iowa Magazine, which I get, did a cover story on the 1969-70 basketball team, which they said united the campus, because at a time when it was just riven between hawks and doves, and the Vietnam War was just made times in classes sometimes so bitter. Iowa did really well, and led by Chad Calabria and Glenn Vidnovic, two ball players. They actually won the Big Ten, and I think maybe for the first time ever. Well, Chad Calabria had been ineligible for low grades. In order to get back on the team, he had to pass his public speaking final, which they did by lottery. So I wasn't his teacher, but I got the job of grading his final. And I can remember sitting there in the front of the room. He gets up, he gives a speech. He had to get above a 12. And I added everything up. He got a 13. He got back on the team. I believe he scored 22 points in his first game. So I take full credit for that success that people will remember.
That's fantastic. Really cool. Thank you for helping him and helping us. We'll maybe take one more here, and then kind of do a couple things before I wrap up. But this has really been fascinating. Is it true you once had a boss who was also an Iowa grad?
Well, that was David Bonnier, yeah. And I have talked about him. I do want to say one thing. There are a lot of reasons that I went into political speech writing. And one reason was, as I didn't realize for decades, I am the clearest example you can find of then undiagnosed attention deficit disorder. And it made every novel that I wrote, every story, a struggle. The focusing was a struggle. I had no idea this was true until about the late 90s when, I, with a sympathetic doctor, I found that out. And the reason I mentioned it is because a lot of times people keep disabilities secret. I think you can manage disabilities, and that was certainly true later than I wish I'd known about it. And so to anybody who's listening, I want to encourage candor about that kind of experience. Then, what other questions do you have?
Well, I think we'll wrap up here. We're right about at time. I do want to let everybody on the call know I'm going to put a link up in the chat, because very timely, our next chat from the Old Cap, which is next week at 3 o'clock Central, is going to be Kylie Reed. And Kylie Reed is a critically acclaimed Iowa Writers Workshop alumna. And she's going to be reading from her book, debut novel, which is a New York Times bestseller, Such a Fun Age. So I would encourage everybody to join us for that.
I will tune in for that too.
Yes, please do. This has really been fascinating. And I put the link up in the chat for everybody if you want to register for that. It's been really interesting to hear, your career and really how relevant things are now on our campus as they were then. It's really been a full circle, and just fascinating to hear these stories. So we truly can't thank you enough. This call has been recorded, and we will put it out on our YouTube page. So we'll send it to everybody here that joined us today. And Bob, we wish you nothing but the best. This has been fascinating. I look forward to hearing from your questions for Kylie next week on Chat from the Old Cap.
I will listen. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in.
Thank you. The pleasure has been ours. So have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next week.
Good. Take care. Be safe. Wear masks.